He hit her on a Tuesday. That was the detail Eliza Hartwell could never shake loose. Not the blood on her lip, not the sound her body made when it hit the kitchen wall, not even the way Victor Hale straightened his collar afterward like he'd done nothing more than swat a fly. It was the day. A Tuesday. As if violence needed a schedule. She'd been married to him for 14 months, long enough to learn which floorboards to avoid after midnight. Long enough to know that his anger had a smell. Whiskey, and something underneath it, something older and sour that she didn't have a word for. Long enough to understand that if she stayed another Tuesday, there wouldn't be a Wednesday. So she left on a Thursday, while he slept. With $31 folded inside her boot and a train ticket to a town she'd chosen because it was the farthest name she could find on the map. That was 18 months ago. Now she stood on the platform of a station so small it didn't rate a sign, in a part of Texas that looked like the earth itself had given up, and she thought, I may have made a terrible mistake. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button if you believe a woman can rebuild everything from nothing. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The wagon that met her at the station belonged to a man named Doyle, who worked for Thornridge Ranch and who had the conversational personality of a fence post. He confirmed her name, loaded her bag without being asked, and said exactly 4 words during the 40-minute ride out to the property. Road gets rough here. It did. Eliza held the bench with both hands and watched the land open up around her, flat and bleached and enormous, the kind of country that didn't comfort you so much as humble you. She'd grown up in Georgia, where the trees were close and the air was thick enough to chew. This place felt like the opposite of everything she'd known. No cover, no shade, nowhere to hide. She told herself that was fine. Hiding hadn't worked out for her anyway. The ranch appeared at the end of a rutted track, and it looked exactly the way a place looks when it's being held together by stubbornness rather than money. The main house was a solid structure, good bones, her mother would have said, but the porch railing leaned, 2 window shutters hung at wrong angles, and the horse paddock fence was mended in so many places it looked like a quilt. A water trough near the barn had a crack along one side, the wood around it dark and warped where water had been seeping into the ground. Doyle pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down without ceremony. Eliza stepped down herself before he could decide whether to help her. The man who came out of the house was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. The agency's letter had described Colton Wilder as a widower of good standing, 38 years of age, in possession of a cattle ranch in Brewster County, seeking a capable woman to manage a household and assist in raising 2 children. The words capable woman had been underlined by whoever had processed her application, as if they'd wanted to be sure she understood what she was getting into. Colton Wilder was tall and rangy, and he moved like a man who'd been tired for a long time and had stopped pretending otherwise. His face was the kind that the sun had worked on seriously, all creases and angles, with dark eyes that assessed her in about 2 seconds and didn't much like what they found. He looked at her the way people looked at a tool they'd ordered from a catalog and received wrong. "Miss Hartwell," he said. Not a question. "Mr. Wilder." He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her. She was 5'3" and 112 pounds, and she knew exactly how she appeared to him. Too small, too worn, with the kind of eyes that people called sad without meaning it as a compliment. "The agency said you were experienced with ranch work," he said. "The agency said I was capable of learning ranch work. There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression, but she couldn't read it. "I have 2 children," he said. "Claire's 9. Thomas is 6. They've been through enough. I don't need someone who's going to fall apart on me." "I won't fall apart on you. You look like a strong wind would knock you over." Eliza had heard variations of this her entire life. She was built the way she was built. It had never once stopped her from doing what needed doing. "I'd like to see the water situation," she said. "The trough by the barn has a leak." Colton blinked. "I know it has a leak. How long has it been leaking?" A pause. 3 weeks. "And the supply line to the house, is that also compromised, or just the trough?" Another pause, longer. "Why are you asking about the water?" "Because the ground around that trough is saturated and it's pulling moisture away from the paddock post footings. 2 of them are already soft. You lose a paddock section, you lose a fence line, and then you've got cattle in the wrong places." She paused. "But maybe you'd already noticed that." He hadn't. She could see that plainly. Colton Wilder looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he hadn't quite managed before, and something complicated moved across his face. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't welcome. It was closer to the expression of a man who'd expected a simple problem and received a harder one. "Come inside," he said finally. Clara and Thomas were in the kitchen, and they watched her arrival the way wild animals watch something unfamiliar enter their territory. Very still, very careful, tracking every movement. Clara was the older one, and it showed. She had her father's dark eyes and a posture that was too controlled for a 9-year-old, the kind of composure children develop when they've learned that adults don't always make things better. She said, "Hello, ma'am," in a polite and completely flat voice, and then went back to looking at the table. Thomas just stared. He had a wooden horse in his left hand and he squeezed it tighter when Eliza walked in. Not out of hostility, just out of the deep, instinctive self-protection of a 6-year-old who'd had too many changes too fast. Eliza didn't crouch down to their level or use the soft, sing-songy voice that some adults employed with children, the one that made kids feel like they were being managed. She just said, "I'm Eliza. I'm not going to pretend I know how things work around here yet, so if I do something wrong, you can tell me." Clara looked up. Just for a second. Thomas kept staring, but his grip on the horse loosened slightly. The kitchen itself told her things. The floor had been swept recently, but not mopped in a while. The curtains over the window were faded to near colorlessness. A pot hung over the stove with the remnants of something that had been the same thing for multiple days running. 2 of the cabinet doors were missing their hinges and had been propped closed instead. The larder, when she glanced at it, was stocked. He wasn't letting the children go hungry, but the variety was poor and the organization was the organization of a man who'd been surviving rather than living. "Are you hungry?" Clara asked. It came out careful and watchful, like she was testing something. "I ate on the train," Eliza said, "but I'd take some water if there's any to spare." "There's always water," Thomas said, with the gravity of a child reporting an important fact, and Clara immediately looked at him with older sibling exasperation. "We have plenty of water," Clara said. "Thomas means we have a well." "Good wells are not something to take lightly," Eliza said, and she meant it sincerely enough that both children looked at her for a moment before looking away. Colton came in from the back of the house and set her bag down near the hall. "Room at the end," he said. "It's not much." "I don't need much." He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed, and she could feel him working something out internally. Recalculating, maybe, or just trying to figure out what category she fit into. He was a man who liked things sorted. She could see that in the way the barn was arranged compared to the house. The barn was orderly. The house was the place where order had lost the battle. "We'll talk more in the morning," he said, "about what's expected." "Before we do that," Eliza said, "I want to look at the water line tonight, while there's still an hour of light. It'll keep until morning. The paddock posts might not." He stared at her. She stared back. She was very good at not blinking first. She'd had practice. "Doyle can take you," he said. "I don't need Doyle, just point me at it." He pointed. She went. The supply line was a mess, not catastrophically broken, but neglected in the particular way that things got neglected on a ranch, where one person was trying to do the work of 3. A coupling joint near the secondary distribution point had been seated wrong at some point and was allowing a slow seep. Eliza found it by following the wet ground downhill from the trough. She didn't fix it that night. She didn't have the materials, but she mapped it in her head and noted what she'd need. What she also noticed, crouched in the dirt in her traveling clothes with her hands in the damp ground, was that the problem had been ignored for much longer than 3 weeks. The soil compaction pattern told its own story. This had been seeping for months. Colton either didn't know how to read it or had been too overwhelmed to do anything about it. She suspected the latter. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sky, which was doing something spectacular now that the sun was going down. All orange and deep red, the kind of sunset that looked painted rather than natural. She hadn't had much time for looking at skies in recent years. Victor hadn't approved of what he called her mooning about. Any moment she wasn't moving was a moment she was falling short of some requirement she'd never been given a clear list of. Out here, in the quiet, with nothing but wind and the far-off lowing of cattle and the first few stars appearing, she let herself breathe. Not safely. She wasn't foolish enough to think she was safe. She didn't know these people, and she didn't know this land, and there was still something coiled tight in the base of her chest that hadn't unwound in 18 months. But she let herself breathe, which was something. She heard boots on the ground behind her and knew without looking that it was Colton. "You didn't go back inside," he said. "I'm watching your sky." He came and stood beside her. Not close, keeping a person width of space between them like they were two strangers on a stage platform, which, she supposed, they were. "It does that every night," he said. "Gets people." "It should." A pause. The wind moved through the grass somewhere out past the fence. "My wife liked it," he said, and then said nothing else. Eliza didn't offer condolences. He clearly wasn't asking for them. She filed the information away the same way she'd filed the crack in the trough and the soft paddock posts, as something that mattered, that was part of the structure of the place, that she needed to understand before she could understand anything else. "The joint on the supply line is 3/4 of the way down toward the secondary point," she said. "Needs a new coupling piece and about an hour of work. Once that's fixed, I can redirect the flow pattern so the trough refills more evenly. You'll lose less water per day, which matters more out here than it would somewhere else." Colton looked at her. The sunset light was doing something to his face that made him look younger, or maybe just less defended. "How do you know about water systems?" he asked. "I don't, particularly. I know about what breaks and why things stop working and what you can do with limited resources to make something functional again." She shrugged. "That's a set of skills you pick up." She didn't say how. She wasn't ready to say how. He seemed to hear the part she wasn't saying. He didn't push. "Morning," he said. "We'll talk about what you're here to do. I thought I was here to manage the household and help raise the children. You are. Then I'm also here to fix the water line, because the household can't be managed properly if the ranch isn't functional, and the children can't be raised in a place that's falling apart underneath them." Another one of those long pauses. She was starting to think they were just how he processed things. Not hostility, just the rhythm of a man who'd been alone long enough that conversation had gotten unfamiliar. "Fine," he said. She wasn't sure what she'd won exactly, but she'd won something. Her room at the end of the hall was not much as advertised. A narrow bed with a quilt that had been washed into softness over many years. A single window facing the back pasture, a washstand with a basin and a cracked mirror. A hook on the back of the door. Eliza set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Clara's voice somewhere down the hall, low and unintelligible. The creak of Colton's boots on the floorboards. The distant complaint of cattle. Small sounds. Ordinary sounds. She took off her left boot and removed the folded bills inside. $23 now. She'd spent $8 getting here. She smoothed them on her knee and counted them and put them back. Old habit. Know what you have. Know what you can carry. The bruise on her left forearm had finally faded to yellow, but she could still feel it if she pressed, a deep ache that lived in the bone. Victor had caught her arm in the doorway of the bedroom, 3 weeks before she left. She'd been trying to get to the hall. He'd been trying to stop her from doing that. She'd gotten past him eventually. It had cost her the arm. She pulled her sleeve down and lay back on the bed in her clothes and stared at the ceiling. The wood had water stains in one corner. Someone had attempted to patch a crack along the center beam with a strip of canvas that had since curled at the edges. A spider had built a web in the upper corner above the door, and the web was large and well established, meaning no one had disturbed the room in some time. The last woman who'd slept in this room, Eliza thought, had been Colton's wife. She didn't know her name, didn't know how she'd died, didn't know anything about her except that she had been loved. She could see it in the quilt, which had been made by someone who knew what they were doing, and in the careful way the wash basin was positioned, and in the half-finished embroidery hoop on the windowsill that no one had put away. Eliza looked at that hoop for a long time, blue thread through white linen, a half-made flower, left mid-stitch. She should probably put it in a drawer. Out of respect, and out of the practical need to make the room feel less like a place she was borrowing. But she didn't touch it that first night. It felt too much like erasing something. She fell asleep earlier than she expected, which surprised her. She'd barely slept in the month before she left Georgia, her body on constant alert, every creak of the house waking her. But out here, in the quiet and the dark, something in her finally lay down. Not peacefully, not without the low electric hum of vigilance she carried everywhere, but down. She slept. Morning arrived with the sound of Thomas, who woke up loud. Eliza heard him down the hall before full light. Not crying, just energetically present, with the kind of morning announcements that 6-year-olds deliver regardless of audience. She was dressed before the sun was fully up, and in the kitchen before Clara had gotten the stove going properly. "You don't have to do that," Clara said, in a voice that wasn't unfriendly, but wasn't sure either. "I know." Eliza looked at the stove. It was a good stove, old but well made, and the flue was drafting the wrong direction. That was why the fire kept wanting to die in the middle of cooking. Not the wood, not the kindling, but the flue. "Can I show you something?" Clara looked at her warily. "About the stove," Eliza said. "It's pulling draft the wrong way. It's not your fault. Whoever set it up angled the damper plate backward." Clara's wariness shifted into something closer to interest, though she clearly didn't want to show it. "It keeps going out," she said. "I know. Here. Watch this." She adjusted the damper. The fire caught and steadied almost immediately, and the warmth began coming off the stove in a way that was noticeably different, direct and constant rather than fitful. Clara watched, said nothing for a moment, then, "How do you know how to do things like that?" "Practice," Eliza said, "and making mistakes. Mostly making mistakes." Thomas appeared in the doorway, still in his nightshirt, carrying the wooden horse, and looking at Eliza with a directness that children had and adults mostly lost. "Did you sleep in Mama's room?" he asked. Clara went still. "I slept in the room at the end of the hall," Eliza said. "I think it might have been your mother's at some point. I hope that's all right." Thomas considered this with great seriousness. "Mama liked that room because of the window," he said. "She said you could see the whole back pasture from the bed." "You can," Eliza said. "It's a good window." Thomas nodded, satisfied with this answer in the way that children were sometimes satisfied by the simplest possible truth. He went and climbed onto his chair at the table and began making the wooden horse walk across the surface in small, deliberate steps. Clara moved to the counter and began slicing bread, and her shoulders were not quite as tight as they'd been the night before. Colton came in at 7. He looked at the stove and then at Eliza and then at Clara. "Fire's even," he said. "The damper was angled wrong," Clara said, and she said it as though she'd discovered this herself, which Eliza thought was exactly the right thing. Colton sat down at the head of the table, and Eliza poured coffee without being asked, and put a cup in front of him and then sat down at the side that left the children between them. Not a deliberate strategic choice, just where there was room. They ate. The bread was good. Clara had made it herself, and it was the bread of a child who'd been cooking out of necessity for long enough to get actually skilled at it. "How old were you when you started cooking?" Eliza asked her. 7, Clara said. "Not defensive, just informational." Eliza nodded. Didn't say anything more about it. She could do the math. Clara's mother had been gone long enough that a 7-year-old had learned to cook out of necessity, which meant at least 2 years, which meant Thomas had been 4 when he lost her, which meant these children had been carrying something very heavy for what was, in their short lives, a very long time. She looked at her bread and ate it and didn't let any of that show on her face. After breakfast, she and Colton walked out to the waterline. He watched her work with the same expression he'd worn since she arrived. Not hostile, not warm, but carefully calibrating. She was on her knees in the dirt, her sleeves rolled up, working the coupling joint loose with a wrench she'd found in the barn that was slightly the wrong size for the job, but manageable if you were patient. "The agency said you were a school teacher," Colton said. He was leaning against the fence, arms crossed, not helping, not helping. "I was," she said. "Before." "Before what?" She turned the wrench. "Before I wasn't." The joint came loose and she caught the spray of water with her forearm, soaking her sleeve to the elbow. She sat back and looked at the fitting. As she'd suspected, the threading was intact, just improperly seated. "You were married before," he said. It wasn't a question. The agency had told him some things, she supposed. "I was." "What happened?" She looked up at him. He met her eyes without flinching, which she respected, even if the question was one she wasn't prepared to fully answer. "He wasn't a safe person to be married to," she said, and eventually I agreed with myself about that. Colton was quiet for a moment. The The sun was already climbing, and the heat was starting to come off the ground in that particular dry earth way that felt like an oven door opening. The agency said there might be complications, he said. They didn't say what. The agency shouldn't have said anything. She kept her voice even. It isn't their information to give. I've got children here, Miss Hartwell. If there's something coming that's going to land on this ranch, I need to know. She looked up at him again, held it. There might be, she said. I don't know if I was followed here. I took precautions. I changed routes twice and I used a different name at one of the stations. She paused. I genuinely don't know if it's enough. She'd expected him to be angry, or at minimum, to put her back in the wagon and send her to the station. Instead, he said, What's his name? She blinked. The man you left, he said. What's his name? Victor Hale. He repeated it to himself once, like he was filing it. Then, what does he look like? Something very strange happened in Eliza's chest. Something she didn't have a word for. A shift in pressure, like a crack forming in ice that has been solid for a very long time. No one had ever asked her that question. What does he look like? Like he was already assuming she wasn't wrong. Like the information was something he intended to use. Tall, she said. Heavier than he looks. Dark red hair going gray at the temples. He has a scar through his left eyebrow from a fight he was in before I knew him. He doesn't go anywhere without a gun on his hip, and he's accurate with it. Colton listened to all of this without any visible reaction. Then he said, All right, and turned back toward the barn. That's all? She called after him. He stopped. Didn't turn around. What do you want me to say? She didn't answer because she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure what she'd wanted. Something. Some kind of acknowledgement of the weight of what she'd just handed him. He turned halfway. His profile was sharp in the morning light. I don't know you, he said. You don't know me. We made an arrangement that I'm not sure either of us is entirely happy with. A pause. But you're here. And if something's coming, we'll deal with it when it comes. In the meantime, you fix my water line and I'll keep the cattle from running off the south edge of the property. That's what this week looks like. He went to the barn. Eliza looked down at the coupling joint in her hand, at the mud on her knees, at the long flat reach of the land around her. She put the joint back in and started threading it properly. By noon, she'd fixed the line. It wasn't elegant work. She'd improvised in two places where the original fittings were too degraded to reseat, but it held, and the water ran clean and even, and the trough filled without seeping into the ground. Doyle, who had spent the morning nearby doing things that didn't require him to speak, watched the water fill and said, Huh. 2 of the paddock posts on the west side need to be reset, Eliza said. The ground softening got into the base footings. You'd want to do that before the next rain. Doyle looked at her with the particular expression of a man encountering a species he hadn't previously identified. I'll get to it, he said. I can help. You know how to reset fence posts? I know how to dig. The rest is just physics. He made a sound that might have been a laugh or just a throat clearing and went back to what he'd been doing. Eliza went to find Clara. The girl was in the garden, or what had been a garden at some point. The plot was overgrown but not beyond saving. Clara was crouched at the edge of it, pulling weeds with grim efficiency, and when she heard Eliza approach, she looked up with an expression that was prepared to be defensive. I'm not here to take over, Eliza said. I just want to see what you've got. Clara sat back and looked at the plot. It was clear she'd been working it herself, alone, and doing a reasonable job given her age and the competition from the weeds. Someone had planted well originally. The rows were still discernible underneath the chaos, and there were tomato plants that were leggy but alive, and what might have been squash coming up in the far corner. Mama planted it, Clara said. I've been trying to keep it. She did good work. It keeps getting away from me. Gardens do that, Eliza said. They're not patient. She crouched down beside the girl. Would you want help? Clara looked at her for a long moment, with those dark, serious eyes that saw more than a 9-year-old should have to see. Are you going to stay? She asked. The question landed like a stone in still water. That's my intention, Eliza said carefully. Whether it works out that way. I can't promise things I can't control. Clara considered this for what felt like a long time. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a sketch, rough, done in pencil, clearly by a child, of a garden. Rows labeled in careful handwriting. What to plant where. What her mother had put where the previous season. She held it out. Eliza took it with both hands, looked at it carefully. "Can I borrow this?" she said. "I'll give it back." "You can keep it," Clara said. "I know it by heart." Eliza folded it and put it in her pocket, and they started pulling weeds. That afternoon, while Thomas napped and Clara read at the kitchen table and Colton was out with the cattle, a rider came up the main track. It wasn't Doyle. He was a man she didn't recognize, lean, 40-ish, with the look of someone who stayed just far enough inside legal lines to avoid prosecution, which was its own kind of look once you knew what you were looking for. He pulled up at the house and looked at Eliza, who had come out onto the porch when she heard the horse. "You the new woman?" he said. "I'm Eliza Hartwell. Who are you?" He smiled in the way that men smiled when they wanted you to feel like you were being evaluated. "Name's Pruitt. I work for Mr. Marcus Crow. He wanted to welcome the new arrival to the territory. Also pass along a message to Wilder." "Mr. Wilder's not here right now." "Then I'll leave the message with you." He reached into his coat and produced a folded letter and held it out. When she came down from the porch to take it, he kept it just a fraction of a second longer than necessary before releasing it, which was the kind of small dominance that men like him used to remind you of something you weren't supposed to forget. She took the letter without reacting. "You're going to want to tell your husband," Pruitt said, "that Mr. Crow is still very interested in acquiring the Southern Water Access easement. He's a patient man, but he's been patient a while now." "I'll tell him," she said. Pruitt looked at her for a moment longer. "You seem like a sensible woman. Sensible women understand when a situation has already been decided." "That depends on who's doing the deciding," Eliza said. His smile didn't waver, but something behind it did, just for a second. "Welcome to Brewster County," he said, and turned the horse and left. Eliza stood holding the letter and watched him ride until he was a smear on the horizon. She was not a woman who was easily made afraid. She'd lost her fear of most things in Victor Hale's house. But she knew, with the certainty of someone who'd survived a predator, what a predator looked like when it was circling. And this county, it seemed, had more than one. She went inside and put the letter on the kitchen table and made a pot of coffee and waited for Colton to come home. Colton read the letter the way he read most things, standing up in the middle of the kitchen without sitting down first, like sitting would mean the contents deserved more weight than he was prepared to give them. He read it twice. Then he folded it along the original crease and set it on the table with a deliberate flatness that told Eliza more than his face did. "How long has Crow been after the easement?" she asked. 2 years. He went to the stove and poured coffee into a cup that was already on the counter. His cup, the one he always used. She'd already noticed that. He wanted it when Margaret was still alive. She was the one who told him no the first time. Margaret. The name settled into the room quietly. The children were both outside, Clara in the garden, Thomas trailing Doyle around the barn in the way that small boys trailed anyone who seemed purposeful. Eliza was aware that this was one of the first times she and Colton had been alone in the house together, and that he hadn't seemed to notice or hadn't seemed to care, which told her something about where his mind was. "What's on the southern easement?" she asked. "A creek." He said it the way people said things they'd explained before and were tired of explaining. "Not much of one, but it runs year-round. In this country, year-round water is worth more than the cattle that drink from it. And Crow wants to run his cattle through it. Crow wants to own the water rights outright, take the easement, fence off access, and he controls everything downstream." He drank his coffee. "My cattle drink from that creek. Every rancher south of the ridge drinks from that creek. But you're the one who holds the legal access. My family filed the original water claim in 1861. He set the cup down. "Crow's been trying to buy it, lease it, pressure it, and argue it in every way that doesn't technically require a crime, so far." Eliza thought about Pruitt on the horse, the way he'd held the letter that extra half-second. The smile that said the matter was already settled. "He sent a man named Pruitt to deliver it," she said. "I know Pruitt." "What is he?" Colton looked at her directly. "The kind of man who does what he's told and enjoys it too much." She nodded. She knew the type in different configurations. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The way Pruitt talked. It wasn't like someone making an offer. It was like someone informing you of a conclusion. She chose the next words carefully. In my experience, men talk that way when they believe they have something besides money working in their favor. Colton was quiet for a moment. Outside, Thomas's voice carried from the direction of the barn. Something about the horse, something delighted, the way children found pure delight in things adults had stopped seeing. "I'll look into it," Colton said. "You might want to look fast." He picked up the letter again, looked at it a third time, and then did something she didn't expect. He handed it to her. "You're good at reading situations," he said. "Tell me if I'm missing something." She took the letter and read it. It was formally worded and on good paper. Crow had money, or at least spent it on impressions. The offer was almost reasonable on its surface. A purchase price for the access easement, a timeline, language about fair market value. The threatening part wasn't in what it said, but in a single phrase near the end, given the current uncertainties regarding the Thornridge title filing. "What uncertainties?" she asked. "None that I know of." "That's the point," she said. "He's implying there are some, which means he's either found something in the county records or he's planning to put something there." Colton looked at her. "You think he'd falsify records?" "I think a man who controls enough of a county can make the records say what he wants them to say." She set the letter down. "How long since you had someone review your title filing?" "It's solid. My grandfather filed it. My father renewed it. I've held it for 11 years without challenge." "That's not the same as having someone review it recently." He didn't like being told that. She could see it. Not anger exactly, more the resistance of a man who'd been managing things alone for a long time and had his own internal system for deciding what needed attention and what didn't. She wasn't trying to undermine that system, but she'd grown up watching a father who was also certain about things that later turned out not to be certain at all. "There's a lawyer in town?" she asked. "Ben Aldis. He's decent enough." "Would you be willing to have him look at the filing?" A pause. The particular pause that meant he was recalculating. "I'll think about it," he said. It wasn't yes, but it was further than she'd expected to get in the first week. The town of Harlan was 7 miles from the ranch by road and 5 by the creek path, and Eliza was told in passing that most people took the road because the creek path required crossing a section of land that Marcus Crow owned, and Crow's men had been known to make that crossing unpleasant. She filed this away. 3 days after her arrival, Colton needed feed from the general store and 2 other things she didn't catch, and he asked if she wanted to come along. The phrasing was careful. Not an invitation, not exactly an order, more the way a person asked a question when they'd already decided the answer and were seeing if you agreed. She said yes. They took the wagon, and Thomas came because Thomas had a way of appearing in vehicles before anyone had made a decision about whether he was included. Clara stayed back with Doyle, which Clara preferred anyway. She was not a child who liked town. The ride-in was mostly quiet. Thomas fell asleep against Eliza's arm, somewhere in the second mile, which she hadn't invited but didn't discourage. He was a solid, warm weight, and she was aware that she hadn't been around children much since she'd stopped teaching, and that she'd missed it without knowing she'd missed it. Colton glanced over at one point, said nothing, looked back at the road. Harlan was the size of a town that had believed it would grow and then revised its expectations. A main street with a feed store, a general merchant, a saloon, a small building that served as the land office, and the assayers and probably 2 or 3 other functions depending on the day. A church at the far end, a small hotel, a livery. The people who passed on the street looked at the wagon the way people in small towns looked at anything that had recently changed. Eliza felt the looking. She was practiced at not showing that she felt it. The general store was run by a woman named Pearl Okafor, who was in her late 50s and had the bearing of someone who had long since stopped requiring anyone else's approval. She acknowledged Colton with the comfortable terseness of a long professional relationship and then looked at Eliza with straightforward assessment. "You're the woman Wilder sent for," she said. "Eliza Hartwell," Eliza said. "Pearl." She didn't extend a hand. She was behind the counter and her hands were occupied, but the word had the feel of an offering. "You come from back east?" "Georgia." Pearl made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement. "Long way." "It is." "Georgia women are soft," said a voice from somewhere near the dry goods. Eliza turned. A man she didn't know, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular stance of someone who spoke loudly in stores, because he liked the way it echoed. He was grinning in the way that people grinned when they thought they'd said something clever. "I haven't met many Georgia women," Eliza said pleasantly, "so I can't speak to the general population. I can only say that I'm not." The man's grin stayed where it was, but lost some of its confidence. Pearl made a second sound, this one warmer. "That's Hicks," she said, as if that explained everything, and perhaps it did. Colton was listing items off a piece of paper he'd pulled from his pocket. He'd heard the exchange, she could tell from the slight angle of his head, but he didn't insert himself in it, which she appreciated. She didn't need managing. While Pearl and Colton sorted out the order, Eliza walked the store in the way she always walked spaces, noting, cataloging, assessing. The prices on the board were higher than they should have been for 3 of the items she'd seen on the ranch's existing stock. Not outrageous, but higher than necessity warranted. "Your prices on flour and salt are above county average," she said to Pearl, not accusingly. Pearl looked up with an expression that was more interested than offended. "Are they?" Pearl said. "I saw the October post from the County Merchant Association last week. Thornridge keeps back copies." She'd found them in a drawer in Colton's small office while looking for pen and paper. "Your flour's running 4 cents high, salt's 2 cents over." "Thornridge has a large ongoing account," Pearl said carefully. "I know. That usually comes with a preferred rate, not a penalty." The store was quiet for a moment. Hicks near the dry goods had stopped pretending to look at things. Colton turned from the counter and looked at Eliza. His expression was hard to read. Pearl looked at her for a long moment. One of those looks that was measuring something she didn't name. "The account was reviewed in September," Pearl said. "Some adjustments may not have been updated." "That's understandable," Eliza said. "Would you be able to update them now?" Pearl looked at her for another moment. Then, "I expect I could. 3 cents off the flour, 2 cents off the salt." It wasn't a fortune. But it was the principle of the thing, and the principle mattered, because the principle told Eliza whether she was in a place where a person who paid attention could make things function better, or a place where everything was already decided. It appeared to be the former. "Outside, loading the wagon," Colton said. "That was either brave or foolish." "Pearl didn't seem like a bad person," Eliza said. "Just a businesswoman who'd gotten comfortable with a rate no one was challenging. She'll think twice about you now." "Good." That was the intention. He said nothing, but she caught something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one, maybe. Thomas woke up, wanted a piece of hard candy from the jar on Pearl's counter, was told no, and accepted this with a resignation that suggested experience had taught him which battles to take on. He climbed into the wagon and announced that he'd seen a blue-tailed lizard under the feed store steps, and this was the main event of the day. On the way back, they passed a man on horseback coming the other direction, and Colton's posture changed, not dramatically, not obviously, but Eliza noticed, a kind of stillness that traveled from his shoulders down through his whole body, the way stillness looked when it was working hard. The man on horseback was 50-ish, well-dressed in the careful way of someone who bought quality and maintained it, on a horse that cost more than most men earned in a year. He had gray at his temples and the face of someone who'd learned that authority looked like patience rather than aggression. He slowed his horse when he saw the wagon. "Wilder," he said, pleasantly. "Crow," Colton said, neutrally. So this was Marcus Crow. Eliza looked at him without obviously looking. Crow looked at her. "You must be the new Mrs. Wilder." "Miss Hartwell," she said. "We're not married yet." Something moved across Crow's face. Amusement or recalculation, she wasn't certain. "Well, welcome to the territory, Miss Hartwell. I hope Colton's showing you the better parts of it." "I've been looking at all of it," she said, "including the water situation." A small pause. Crow smiled. "Interesting," he said. "You'll find it's complicated." "Water usually is," she said, "but the legal structure around it tends to be less complicated than people sometimes suggest." The smile stayed perfectly in place. A practiced smile. The kind of smile that meant the man wearing it was working. "I'm sure we'll have occasion to talk more," Crow said. He nodded to Colton. "I'll expect to hear from you about the easement proposal." "You'll hear from my lawyer," Colton said. Something shifted in Crow's eyes. Just for a second, the patience slipping. and then it was back. "Of course," he said, and rode on. Thomas, from the wagon bed, said with no particular awareness of the situation's weight, "That man has a very big horse." "He does," Eliza said. "I don't like his face." Colton made a sound that might, under other circumstances, have been a laugh. Bun Aldous was a lawyer of the lanky, overthought variety, the kind of man who wore his suits one size too large and spoke in careful dependent clauses, as if he was perpetually drafting rather than talking. He was also, Eliza decided within 10 minutes of meeting him, genuinely competent. The affected verbosity was just the way his mind moved, not a performance. He had the Thornridge title documents out within an hour of Colton's request, and spent a further 2 hours with them at a lamp, while Eliza sat in the corner of his office, and Colton stood by the window, and Thomas fell asleep on the bench by the door. "The original filing is solid," Aldous said. "Your grandfather did good work. The 1871 renewal is also clean." He turned a page. "The 1884 update, this one." He set it apart from the others and smoothed it with his palm. "There's an error." Colton came away from the window. "What kind?" "The water rights description uses the 1871 boundary markers. One of those markers, the eastern post, near the creek bend, was resurveyed in 1879 as part of the county consolidation. The survey should have updated the marker description in the title. It wasn't." "Does that affect the claim?" "In principle, no. The intent of the filing is clear, and the chain of title is documented." Aldous took off his glasses and cleaned them with a cloth from his pocket. "But it creates an arguable ambiguity. If someone with resources wanted to claim the 1884 update incorrectly describes the boundary, and if they could connect that argument to the 1879 survey record—" "Crow," Colton said. Aldous put his glasses back on. "I'm not in a position to say that, but I would want to correct this before anyone else points to it." "How?" "A corrective amendment filed with the county clerk and the state land office, supported by the original survey records. It's a procedural matter, not a substantive one, but it has to be done properly, and it has to be done before any challenge is formally entered." "How long?" "If the survey records are accessible and the county clerk cooperates, 2 weeks, possibly 3. Colton looked at Eliza. She wasn't sure what the look was asking. "What are the survey records stored at the land office in town?" she asked Aldous. "The originals, yes. Copies were sent to Austin in 1881. "So there are 2 sets?" "Yes." "And if something were to happen to the Harlan copies—" Aldous looked at her over his glasses. "The Austin copies would still exist." "Good," she said. "I'd want to know that." She wasn't certain that Crow would interfere with county records, but she was certain that a man who sent an employee to deliver letters with implicit threats was a man who thought about options that legal people didn't like to think about. Aldous filed the corrective amendment request that same week. Colton told her on the ride back from the lawyer's office that he hadn't been planning to go see Aldous. "I know," Eliza said. "I was going to let it sit another week." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "You pushed on it," he said. Not accusatory, just stating it. "I did." She looked at the road ahead. The sun was getting lower, throwing the flat land into a different kind of relief, the distances looking shorter than they were. "I pushed because I've seen what happens when a person lets things sit that shouldn't sit. You can run out of time before you realize the clock was running." He didn't answer immediately. She'd noticed he processed things laterally, not ignoring what she said, just taking it somewhere private before he responded to it. "Margaret used to say that," he said eventually, "that I'd wait on things until they were already broken." "She wasn't wrong." He glanced at her sharply. "I didn't mean that as an insult," Eliza said. "It's just, most people who wait are waiting because they hope the problem will sort itself. That's not a character flaw. It's just not always an option." He faced forward again. "She was better at this than I am. The managing. The seeing ahead. You're better at it than you think. You've known me a week. I know what the ranch looked like when I arrived, and I know what you've gotten done in 4 days since." She paused. "The water line, the paddock posts. You wrote to Aldous the same day I asked about it. You're not someone who can't act. You're someone who needed one more voice telling you to." He didn't say anything to that for long enough that she thought she'd overstepped. Then, "What was he like? Victor Hale?" She'd been waiting for this question and still wasn't prepared for it. Why? She asked. Because you push on things the way someone pushes when they spend a long time not being able to push. And I want to understand what I'm dealing with. It was perhaps the most perceptive thing he'd said to her, and also the thing that made her chest go tight in the way that honesty sometimes did when you'd been defended against it. He was charming when he wanted things, she said, which is the worst kind, because you spend a long time thinking the charming version is the real one and the other version is the aberration, and you keep trying to get back to the charming version, and eventually you understand that you had it backward. When did you understand? The night he locked me in the kitchen from the outside because I'd served the soup in the wrong bowl. She said it flatly, without drama, the way you said things you'd already processed beyond the point of performance. It wasn't the worst thing he'd ever done. It wasn't even close. But it was the night I realized it wasn't going to get better, because a person who locks someone in a kitchen over soup has already decided what you are to them, and no amount of correct bowl selection was going to change that. Colton said nothing. The horse moved. Thomas murmured in his sleep in the wagon bed. "I'm sorry," Colton said. The words were simple and he didn't ornament them. "Don't be sorry," Eliza said. "Just don't lock me in any kitchens." A beat. "That's a low bar," he said. "You'd be surprised," she said, "how many men can't clear it." The message arrived on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Eliza came to Thornridge. It was brought by a boy from town, one of the Delacroix children, who ran errands for a few cents, and it was addressed to her in handwriting she didn't recognize. Not Victor's. Victor's handwriting slanted hard to the right like it was chasing something. This handwriting was neutral, employed hand script, the kind you hired when you didn't want to be directly traceable. She sat in the garden and opened it. It was short. 4 lines. No signature. He found the station in Odessa where you bought your ticket. He knows the name you used and the direction you went. He has retained a man who does this kind of finding. You have perhaps a month, possibly less. She read it twice and then folded it and sat for a moment looking at the tomato plants, which were doing better since she'd staked them properly. 3 of them had fruit setting, small and green and determined. She thought about what she'd said to Colton about not running. She thought about 14 months in a house that felt like a trap with good furniture. She thought about the kitchen she'd been locked inside, and the arm she'd hurt getting out of it, and the $31 in her boot on the train platform. She thought about Clara's garden map, folded in her pocket. She thought about Thomas sleeping against her arm in the wagon. She put the letter back in her apron pocket and stood up and went back to staking tomatoes, because the plants didn't know about Victor Hale and didn't need to, and the fruit would set or it wouldn't, and the only thing she could do about either situation was the work in front of her. She told Colton that evening after the children were in bed. She laid the letter on the table between them, the same way he'd laid Crow's letter, with a flat deliberateness. He read it, set it down. "Who sent this?" he asked. "I don't know. Someone who knows I'm here and wanted me warned. Possibly someone from the agency. They keep contact information." "The man he's hired, what can you tell me about what that means?" "It means someone who tracks people for money. Victor has money." She kept her voice steady. "He won't come immediately. He'll have the man confirm my location first, make sure before he spends the money on the journey. So we have time." "Some. Not as much as I'd want." Colton looked at the letter, then at her. "Are you thinking about leaving?" he asked. She looked at him directly. "Are you thinking about asking me to?" A long pause. "No," he said. Something in her chest adjusted. Not relief exactly, more like a gear catching that had been slipping. "Then we need to think," she said, "about what we do when he comes, because he will come. We can go to the sheriff." "On what grounds yet? Victor hasn't done anything in this county. He hasn't made a threat that anyone can document. Coming after your wife isn't illegal if the man can argue I'm his wife." "Are you?" "I filed papers in New Orleans," she said, 8 months ago, but the process takes time and Victor has enough money to slow it down." She paused. "Legally, my situation is complicated," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a while. She let him be quiet because she'd learned that his quiet was working quiet, not avoiding quiet. "There's a thing Marcus Crow does when he wants something he can't get directly," Colton said. "He finds a weakness and he levers it open. He's patient and he's clever and he doesn't usually make the mistake of underestimating his opposition." He looked at her. If he somehow knew about Victor Hale, he'd use it, Eliza said. Yes, I had the same thought. Your past would become a tool. My past already is a tool. The question is who's holding it. Colton stood up and went to the window and stood looking out at the dark. The night out here was very dark. No neighbors, no town lights, just the sky, which was excessive with stars in the way of skies that had nothing to compete with. We're not going to let either of them run this ranch, he said. It was addressed to the window as much as to her, which she understood was how he sometimes committed to things, out loud, to the air, like a statement of record. No, she said. We're not. He turned from the window. He looked, she thought, like someone who'd been carrying something for a long time and had just made a decision about it. Not to put it down, but to shift how he was carrying it. Tomorrow I want you to walk the south boundary with me, he said. The creek access, the survey markers, all of it. I want you to see everything, not because you need to, because if something happens to me, someone else needs to know. She held his eyes for a moment. All right, she said. And one other thing. What? Can you shoot? She thought of the kitchen, the locked door, the 14 months. Teach me, she said. He nodded once, like a contract signed. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and somewhere south of the ridge, water ran along a creek bed that two different men believed they could take away from her, and the tomatoes in the garden were setting fruit in the dark, which was the kind of thing that happened whether anyone was watching or not. She went to her room and lay down and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a long time. But when she finally did, she didn't dream about Victor Hale. She dreamed about water and where it went and who it belonged to. The shooting lessons happened at dawn, before the children woke. Colton started her with a rifle, his spare, a Winchester that was older than Thomas, and had the worn stock of a tool that had been used seriously rather than displayed. And he was not a patient teacher in the way that patience is usually performed. He didn't explain more than was necessary, and he didn't soften the corrections. But he was accurate in what he told her, and he repeated the same thing only once, which she respected. You're anticipating the shot, he said the second morning, standing behind her left shoulder, not touching, just observing. You're bracing before you pull, means the barrel moves. I know it does. I'm trying not to. Stop trying. Just wait longer before you decide to pull. Let the sight settle on its own. That sounds like a different kind of trying. It isn't. It's the opposite. You've been solving problems by forcing them your whole life. This one you solve by getting out of its way. She looked at him over her shoulder. He looked back, undefensive. She turned to the fence post they'd set up as a target and waited. Waited longer than felt right. Let the sight do what it wanted to do, which was drift and settle and drift again, and then pull when it settled. The shot went where she'd aimed it. Colton said nothing, which was its own form of acknowledgement. By the end of the first week of lessons, she could hit a stationary target at 40 yards with reasonable consistency. Not well enough to be confident, well enough to know confidence was possible. The south boundary walk happened the day after the letter arrived. It was a full morning of walking, 3 miles of fence line and 2 creek crossings, and a stand of cottonwood that marked the corner of the original land claim. Colton knew every foot of it the way people knew their own houses, with the particular detailed familiarity of someone who'd covered the ground in all conditions and all weathers, and in grief and in better times. He showed her the survey markers, 3 of them still in original position, one replaced in 1891 after a flood that had moved everything in a 50-foot radius of the creek bend. She looked at them and noted their positions, and asked questions about the legal descriptions Aldous had referenced. And Colton answered them with more precision than she'd expected, which meant he understood the situation better than his initial resistance to going to the lawyer had suggested. He just needed the decision made for him. Not because he couldn't make it, because he'd been alone long enough that the deciding had gotten heavy, and sometimes a second voice was the only thing that lifted it back to manageable weight. She didn't say this to him. It wasn't something that needed saying. What she did say, crouched at the creek bank looking at the water, which was lower than it should have been for the season. Someone's upstream. What? The water's low. It's not drought low. The ground moisture doesn't match. Someone's running a diversion upstream. She looked at the bank. Recent. The silt pattern's been disturbed in the last 2 weeks. Colton crouched beside her. He looked at the creek for a long moment. Crow's eastern property borders the headwater, he said. Yes, she said. They looked at each other. He's testing, Colton said, seeing if we notice. He's also doing damage while we notice. Every day the diversion runs, your cattle are drinking less and the creek bed is adjusting downward. She looked at the low water moving over stones. If the bed drops enough, the 1861 claim language about navigable flow becomes arguable. Colton stood up. He had an expression she was coming to know, the one that preceded action, angular and decided, the softness gone out of his face. I'll ride to Aldous tomorrow, he said. Take documentation, photographs if you can get them. Written description of the water level with the date. I know. And take someone with you as witness, not Doyle. He works for you, someone independent. Pearl Okafor's husband is a surveyor. Ask him. He nodded. They walked back to the ranch in the kind of quiet that had, over 3 weeks, become something other than uncomfortable. She didn't know exactly what to call it. Not friendship. They weren't there yet. Or maybe friendship wasn't the right category. More like the quiet between two people who'd agreed on something important without having to say what it was. Clara noticed the change in the water before Eliza told her about it. She came to Eliza 4 days after the creek walk, in the garden where Eliza was tying up the squash vines, and said in her careful adult-child voice, "The cattle have been going to the South Trough more. They don't like the creek water." Eliza looked up. "What do you mean they don't like it?" "They'll drink from it, but they walk to the South Trough if they can. Papa says cattle don't have preferences." Clara paused. "But they do." Eliza filed this away. "Have you noticed anything else different? About the water, the land, anything in the past few weeks?" Clara thought about it with the seriousness she brought to most things. "Doyle said 2 of the steers are off their feed. He said it was the heat." Another pause. "But it's not hotter than last month." Eliza set down the twine. "Show me the trough they're avoiding." The creek-fed trough was on the south side of the main pasture, and when Eliza looked at the water in it, she didn't see anything obviously wrong. But she collected a jar of it anyway, the kind of clear glass jar she'd found repurposed in the kitchen for preserving, and she set it on the window in her room where the morning light would come through it. In the morning, the water was not clear, not dramatically contaminated, not immediately obvious, but with morning light through clear glass, you could see a faint brownish cast that hadn't settled out overnight and a rim of something yellowish at the waterline. She showed it to Colton at breakfast. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "Salt intrusion," he said finally, "or mineral, from upstream." "Or deliberate introduction," she said. He looked at her. "Crow wants the water rights. The fastest way to devalue them is to make the water itself worthless." She held the jar up. "This level isn't enough to seriously harm the cattle yet, but it's enough to make them avoid it, which means they drink less, which means they lose condition, which means at the end of a season you're selling underweight cattle at a discount." "He's degrading the herd without touching the herd." "Yes." Colton set down his coffee cup with a force that wasn't quite slamming. Thomas looked up from across the table with wide eyes. Clara didn't look up, but her hands on her bread went still. Eliza put the jar down and said, in a voice calibrated for the children, "There are problems with the South water and your father is going to fix them." Thomas looked from her to his father and back. "Is it bad?" he asked. "It's solvable," Eliza said. "Those are different things." Thomas accepted this. Clara slowly resumed eating. Aldous filed an emergency motion with the county water board the following week, with Okafor's survey and Eliza's water sample, and a written testimony from the county veterinarian, who had seen the cattle and concurred about the contamination without being able to definitively name the source. It was enough to compel an inspection. Whether the inspection would produce results was another question, and it depended entirely on whether Marcus Crowe had enough of the county apparatus in his pocket to manage the outcome. On the day the water board inspector came out from Harlan, Eliza stood with Colton at the creek and answered questions, and showed the survey markers and produced the documentation Aldous had prepared. The inspector was a slight man named Garfield who sweated through his collar before the morning was half done, and who wrote things in a small notebook with the intense concentration of a man who was very aware of being watched. Afterward, walking back to the ranch, Doyle said quietly to Colton, "Garfield's wife works in Crowe's office." Colton said nothing. Eliza said, "Does Garfield have a supervisor?" "County board chairman, fellow named Pettis." "Is Pettis in Crowe's pocket?" Doyle made a face. Not as far as I know, but Crow hasn't needed to buy him yet. Then we file the documentation with Pettis directly as well, Eliza said. Copies to the state land office in Austin. Aldous will know the right channels. She paused. You don't let one man control all the routes. Doyle looked at her with the expression he'd started wearing around her, a kind of resigned acknowledgement, like a man who'd expected a different type of problem and found himself dealing with someone who made his simple problems complicated, and his complicated problems slightly less impossible. The report from Garfield came back inconclusive. Insufficient evidence to establish deliberate contamination, upstream flow variations within normal parameters. Eliza read the report and set it down and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, He didn't find what he wasn't looking for, but his report also doesn't say there's no problem, which means Aldous can file again if conditions worsen. They will worsen, Colton said. He was at the kitchen table with the report, and his voice had a flatness she associated with exhaustion rather than defeat. Crow doesn't stop when one approach doesn't work. He just waits and tries the next one. So do we. He looked at her. You're not tired of this yet? I've been tired of things for years, she said. Tired doesn't stop me. He looked at her for another moment, a different kind of looking than he'd done in the first weeks, without the assessment quality it had started with. More direct, less guarded. What does stop you? He asked. She considered it honestly. I don't know yet. I haven't found it. The second message about Victor came not by letter, but by person. A woman arrived at the ranch on a Thursday afternoon. A woman Eliza had known 4 years ago, before Victor, when she'd been teaching in a small school outside Atlanta. Nora Beale, who had since married and moved to San Antonio, and who looked at Eliza from the wagon seat with an expression that was both relieved and frightened. He hired a man named Collier, Nora said, in the kitchen, with the children sent outside and Colton standing in the doorway. Cole Collier. He's a tracker. He found 2 women Victor had before you. Found both of them. She stopped. One came back with him. And the other? Eliza asked. Nora shook her head. A silence. Where's Collier now? Eliza asked. He was in Odessa a week ago, asking about a woman matching your description who'd passed through, bought a train ticket. Nora's hands were in her lap and she was pressing them together. He's good at this, Eliza. He's very good at this. How long to get from Odessa here if he's working the trail? A week, maybe. If he's careful, 2. Eliza looked at her hands on the table, then at Colton. Colton's face had gone to that angular, decided place. Will Victor come himself? Not until Collier confirms the location, Nora said. He doesn't like to be wrong in front of people. He'll wait until it's certain. A pause. But once it's certain, he'll come. He won't send someone else for the last part. It's not business for him. It's personal. Why? Colton said. He has money. He could find another woman. Nora looked at him with the particular expression of someone who'd seen enough of the world to know that question had the wrong framework. Because she left, she said. That's the whole reason. Colton absorbed this. Nodded once, slowly. Nora stayed for dinner, which Clara managed with an efficiency that was slightly showing off, the way children showed off for visitors when they wanted to demonstrate something about themselves. Thomas asked Nora 47 questions about San Antonio, many of them unanswerable. The meal was ordinary and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and afterward Nora sat with Eliza on the porch in the dark, while the children went to bed. You look different, Nora said. Different how? Less like you're bracing for something. Nora paused. You always walked like you were waiting for it to land. Even before Victor, I thought Eliza is waiting for something bad. But now you're, she considered. Less like that. Eliza thought about this. I'm still waiting, she said. I'm just waiting somewhere I chose to be. Nora left in the morning. She hugged Eliza at the wagon and didn't say everything she was thinking, which was kindness. Colton called it straight the night Nora left. They were at the kitchen table again, in the position they'd ended up in so many times that it had started to feel like a designated place for difficult conversations. Colton across from her, the lamp between them, the house quiet and dark in every direction for 40 miles. I need to move some cattle, he said. The south herd's been cut off from the creek access long enough. I need to shift them to the north pasture before they lose more condition. I can't do it from here. It's a 2-day push minimum, and I need to take Doyle. Eliza looked at him. She understood what he wasn't quite saying. Collier could arrive while you're gone, she said. Yes. Or Victor himself, if Collier moves faster than Nora estimated. Yes. A pause. The lamp flame was still. No draft in the kitchen tonight, the air too heavy for movement. You don't have to go now, she said. I've already lost 3 weeks waiting, he said. If I don't move the herd, I'll lose 20% of my cattle condition going into fall market. I'd be selling at a loss on top of everything Crow's already cost me. He was looking at the table. If I wait for this to be resolved before I do the ranch work, the ranch won't be there to save. He was right. She'd known he was right before he said it. How long? 3 days if it goes right, 4 if it doesn't. Leave me Doyle. I need Doyle for the cattle, 2 men minimum for that herd. Then leave me the rifle. I was going to. She looked at him. Is there anyone in town I can contact if something goes wrong? Someone with authority who isn't in Crow's arrangement? The sheriff he's complicated. He doesn't take money from Crow directly, but he's careful around him. If you send word through Pearl Okafor, she'll know how to move it in the right direction. He paused. Pearl's husband is one of 3 men in this county Crow has never managed to get to. Pearl, she said. All right. He looked at her, long enough that she felt it. I wouldn't go if I thought it wasn't survivable, he said. I know. The children. I know, she said again, more quietly. He held her eyes for another moment, then looked at the table. I've been alone too long, he said. I forgot how to think about what I'm leaving behind. She didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't sure he meant it the way it landed, or if he meant it more plainly than that, or if he himself knew the difference. She let it sit. Go move your cattle, she said. I'll take care of the ranch. He left at first light on Saturday, Doyle beside him, the south herd already visible on the lower pasture being pushed by the border collie in widening arcs. Clara stood on the porch and watched the dust rise. Thomas didn't watch. He asked when Papa would be back and was told 3 or 4 days and said, okay, with the particular resignation of a 6-year-old to whom 3 days was a geologic era, and then went to find the dog. Eliza spent Saturday making preparations she didn't announce as preparations. She checked the rifle, loaded, clean, properly seated. She found the second shotgun in the back of the equipment closet, an older piece she'd noticed early on, checked its condition, cleaned and loaded it too. She moved it to the kitchen, placed against the wall beside the larder in a position accessible but not visible from the doorway. She looked at the windows. The house had 4, 2 in the main room, 1 in the kitchen, 1 in the back bedroom. The shutters on 3 of them worked. The 4th, the kitchen window, had a shutter that had lost its latch and required a wedge. She found a wedge. She looked at the doors. The front door had a bar. The back door had a bolt that she'd noticed was loose in its housing. 2 of the screws had backed out of aging wood. She found screws and a driver in the barn and reset them. The bolt seated properly for the first time in what was probably years. She showed Clara how to bar the front door from inside. You're getting ready for something, Clara said. Eliza looked at her, 9 years old, with her mother's eyes. There may be a man who comes looking for me, Eliza said. Not for you, not for your father, not for the ranch, for me. And I need to know that if he does, you and Thomas will do exactly what I tell you. Clara was quiet for a moment. She had the still quality of a child absorbing something large. Is he dangerous? She asked. Yes. More dangerous than what we've already dealt with? Eliza looked at her and thought, what a thing to ask at 9 years old. What a weight to have on you, that the question comes that naturally. Different dangerous, Eliza said. Crow wants the land. This man wants something more personal, which means he's less predictable. She paused. But I know him. I know how he thinks. That matters. Clara was quiet again. Then, what do we do? If I tell you to take Thomas to the root cellar, you go. You don't argue, you don't wait, you go. You take the lantern and the door latches from inside. How long do we stay? Until I come for you or until you hear your father's voice? And if neither of those things happens, Eliza held her eyes. Then you wait until morning and you walk to town on the road. Not the creek path, the road. Clara absorbed this with terrible composure. Okay, she said. Sunday passed quietly. Monday passed quietly. Tuesday was when the dog started acting wrong. The border collie, whose name was Fleet, which Thomas had given him after prolonged reflection, spent Tuesday morning at the north edge of the property, barking in the sustained, alert way that wasn't rabbit barking or cow barking or the social bark that happened when Doyle arrived. It was a specific register. Eliza had grown up enough around working dogs to know the register. Someone was at the perimeter. She brought the children inside and barred the front door. She stood at the kitchen window, the one she'd wedged, and watched the approach road and the tree line north of the property. Nothing for an hour. Then movement at the tree line. A man she didn't know, coming cautiously, stopping at the fence line and looking at the house. Looking at it with the professional attention of someone mapping it. Collier. He didn't come to the door. He looked at the house for perhaps 5 minutes, long enough to see that the shutters were closed, that there was smoke from the kitchen stove, that there was no horse in the near paddock. And then he went back into the tree line. He was confirming, not acting yet, reporting back. Her stomach did something cold and controlled. She waited another hour before she let the children out of the kitchen. She didn't tell them what she'd seen. She made lunch and listened to the land. Tuesday night she didn't sleep. Wednesday morning she wrote a note and gave it to Fleet with a piece of rope around his neck, a trick she'd heard Doyle describe. The dog could make it to the Okafor place in under 2 hours if pointed right, but she didn't send him yet. Sending the dog meant she couldn't take it back, and she didn't know enough about the timing. Wednesday afternoon, a rider came up the approach road, not cautious, not mapping, coming directly. She knew the way the horse moved. She knew the set of the shoulders. She'd spent 14 months learning to read them from across a room, from down a hall, from the sound of boots on stairs. Victor Hale had found her. She sent the children to the root cellar. Clara took Thomas by the hand without a word and went, and the latch clicked shut from inside, and held it down at her side and breathed. The horse stopped outside. She heard him dismount, heard his boots on the hard ground. She knew those boots. Then his voice through the door. Eliza. Not shouting. Conversational, almost. The charming version, deployed like a tool. I know you're in there. The dog was here and he's gone now, which means you sent him, which means you're still here. She said nothing. I'm not angry, he said. That was the charm, smooth and practiced and designed to make her feel like the problem was hers to solve. I understand why you left. We can talk about it. Just come to the door. She moved to the side of the kitchen window, not in front of it, beside it, and looked through the gap between the shutter edge and the frame. He was exactly as she'd described him to Colton. Heavier than he looked, dark red hair silver at the temples, the scar through his left brow that caught the light. He dressed well for the journey, which was Victor. He dressed well for occasions he'd decided mattered. He had a gun on his hip. Collier was not visible, which meant he was somewhere she couldn't see, which meant she was more exposed than she wanted to be. I'm not going to the door, Victor, she said, loud enough to carry through the wood. A pause. When he spoke again, the conversational quality had an edge under it, the way it always got an edge when she didn't do what he expected immediately. Don't be foolish. You don't have anywhere to go. I know you're here alone. I'm not alone. The ranch hand and the owner rode out Saturday. There's no one here but you and those children. He paused. I don't want any trouble with Wilder. This isn't about his property. This is between us. She moved from the kitchen to the main room, staying low, to the second window with its working shutter, which gave her an angle on the south side of the house where she couldn't see from the kitchen. Collier was there, 40 feet out, by the corner of the barn. He was watching the house. 2 of them. She'd known. But knowing and seeing were different. She went back to the kitchen. Eliza, Victor's voice had gone flatter. Open the door. No. I will break it. Then break it, she said. And when you do, you'll find I'm not the woman you remember. A silence. He didn't like surprises, and he didn't like variables, and she'd just handed him both. She positioned herself behind the kitchen table, cover, not concealment. She'd learned the difference from Colton in those early mornings, with the rifle set and her hand steady. She was afraid. She could feel it in the electric quality of her skin, the narrowed tunnel of her attention, the too clear way the lamp's shadow fell across the floor. Fear was not the same as stopping. She'd learned that a long time ago, in a kitchen with a locked door. The front door shook in its frame. He was testing the bar. She held the rifle and waited. The sound that followed was not the door. It was the back of the house, Collier, moving. He'd found the back door. She turned, repositioned, and the back door held. The reseated bolt held. A bang, harder. The wood shook, but the bolt didn't give. Victor's voice again, no charm left in it now, just the flat operational voice he used when he'd decided something. Coal. Window. She moved. She moved faster than she'd known she could move, to the far side of the kitchen, away from the window, because she knew what came next. And what came next was the shuttered kitchen window exploding inward, shutter and frame and all. And a man's body coming through it with a force that told her he'd run at it from the outside. Collier hit the kitchen floor and got upright faster than she'd expected, which meant he'd done this before. And he saw her across the room and started toward her, and she leveled the rifle and said, "Stop." He didn't stop. She fired. She hit him in the shoulder. Not where she'd aimed. She'd aimed center mass, Colton's instruction. Don't try to be precise when you're afraid. Aim for what's largest, but close enough. He went sideways and down and hit the counter and stayed down, making a sound that was mostly breath. The front door bar cracked. Victor was stronger than doors when he was decided, which she'd also learned the hard way. The bar cracked, and the door came in, and Victor Hale was in her house, and she turned with the rifle, and he crossed the room in 3 steps and got his hand on the barrel before she could fire, and the rifle went sideways, and something in her wrist torqued hard, and her hand went wrong. She let go of the rifle. He grabbed her arm, the left arm, the same arm, always the same arm, and she felt the bone-deep ache wake up like it had never left. "Enough," he said. Very close. His face had gone past charming and past flat and into the place she'd seen only a few times in 14 months, the place that was entirely without calculation. "You're done running." "I know," she said. He blinked. She'd agreed. He hadn't expected that. In the half-second it bought her, she drove her right elbow into his jaw with everything she had. It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't practiced, and it didn't put him down. He was bigger and heavier, and her wrist was bad. But it rocked him back a step, and she put the kitchen table between them and grabbed the shotgun from beside the larder. He looked at the shotgun. He looked at her face. She didn't look like the woman who'd left Georgia. She didn't feel like her either. "I told you," she said, and her voice only shook a little. "I'm not the woman you remember." He looked at her for a long moment. He was breathing hard. The calculation was coming back into his face. The charming version's older brother, the one that was just as dangerous but dressed better. "You won't shoot me," he said. "You broke into this house," she said. "You hurt me for 14 months. You hired a man to track me across 3 states. She kept the shotgun level. Her wrist was screaming and her hands were not entirely steady, and she was aware that Collier was still on the kitchen floor behind her, and she didn't know how badly hurt he was. "Tell me one thing I owe you." He said nothing. "Tell me one reason I put this down." He took a step forward. She pulled the hammer back. The sound it made in the kitchen was very small and very loud. He stopped. Outside, at the edge of perception, over the blood in her ears, and the screaming of her wrist and the sound of her own breathing, she heard something she hadn't dared hope for. Hoofbeats. Coming fast. Victor heard them too. Something moved across his face, the first thing she'd seen in 14 months of knowing him that looked like actual uncertainty. The hoofbeats didn't slow at the gate. They came all the way to the house. Colton came through the broken front door with a rifle already in his hands. He took in the room in the way a man took in a room when he'd been riding hard for 2 days on a feeling he couldn't name and had arrived at the thing he'd been afraid of finding, fast, total, and without any illusion that it would be simple. His eyes went to Eliza first, then to Victor, then to the shotgun in her hands and the angle she was holding it. He didn't say anything immediately. He just put himself between her and Victor, which placed 3 people in a kitchen that wasn't built for 3 people with firearms, and the geometry of it was very bad. "Colton Wilder," Victor said. He'd recovered some of his composure. That was the thing about Victor. He recovered fast. He'd learned to perform calm the same way other men learned to perform strength. "This isn't your business." "You're in my house," Colton said. "She's my wife." "She filed papers in New Orleans 8 months ago," Eliza said from behind Colton's shoulder. "You know she did. You had a man contest them." Victor looked at her. The look had a weight to it that she knew. The specific gravity of his attention when he'd decided something and was waiting for the right moment. "Papers take time," he said. In the meantime, you're in my house, Colton said again, with a man you brought who put a hole in my kitchen wall and is bleeding on my kitchen floor. And you've hurt this woman, who I can see from here has a wrist that's wrong. He hadn't raised his voice. There was something more dangerous in the steadiness than there would have been in volume. So you're going to set your gun on the table, both of you, him too, if he can manage it. Victor assessed him. Eliza knew that assessment, the way Victor measured a man, looking for the fulcrum point, the place where pressure would shift things in his direction. He didn't find it. Colton was not a man who had a fulcrum point visible from the outside. The gun, Colton said. Collier from the floor was in no condition to argue about anything. He'd gotten himself to a sitting position against the lower cabinet and was holding his shoulder with the focused internal attention of a man whose body was consuming all his available processing. He didn't reach for the gun on his hip. He looked at Victor and waited. Victor looked at Colton for a moment longer. Then, with the careful deliberateness of a man who was losing a round but not the game, he reached slowly to his hip and set his gun on the table. Yours too, Colton said to Collier. Doyle appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, breathless from running from the paddock where he'd left the horses, and took in the scene with the expression of a man who had specifically not signed up for this kind of thing and was having it anyway. He crossed the kitchen, picked up Victor's gun, and took Collier's from its holster with the careful competence of someone who'd handled situations with armed men before, which Eliza supposed in this country was most men eventually. Root cellar, Eliza said. Doyle nodded and went. Clara unlatched the cellar door from inside before he reached it. She'd been listening, and she'd heard her father's voice, and came out with Thomas at her side, and Thomas took one look at the kitchen and attached himself to Eliza's leg without a word, which was its own kind of communication. Eliza put her good hand on his head and kept the shotgun in her other hand, wrist and all, because she wasn't putting it down yet. She wasn't ready to put it down yet. So, Victor was tied to a chair in the main room, which was undignified and he knew it, and which Doyle managed with a rope from the barn while Colton watched. Collier was in worse shape. The shoulder wound had stopped bleeding seriously, but it needed a doctor, and Colton sent Doyle to town to get one and to bring the sheriff, in that order. Clara took Thomas to the kitchen and made him something warm because she was Clara, and making something warm was how she responded to disaster, and Eliza stood in the doorway between the rooms, able to see Victor, able to see the children, and let the wrist hurt now that it was over. Not broken. She'd had broken. This was a bad sprain, something pulled or torqued in the tendons. It would heal. Everything had healed before. Colton came and stood beside her. How did you get back? She said quietly. Doyle said 3 days minimum. Fleet found us at the South Camp Wednesday night. He kept his voice low. I'd told Doyle before we left. If the dog comes without you, we ride back. She looked at him. You planned for that. I wasn't not thinking about it. He looked at the floor for a moment, the way he looked at things when he was being more honest than was entirely comfortable. I thought about turning back twice before the dog came. Didn't have a reason I could justify, just a feeling. She didn't say anything about that. It didn't need a response. Your wrist, he said. It'll be all right. Let me see. She held it out, and he looked at it with the matter-of-fact practicality of someone who'd dealt with enough injuries on a ranch to know what he was looking at. And the way he held it, carefully, with his big calloused hands under hers like something he was weighing, was nothing dramatic. It was just hands. It still did something she wasn't prepared for. Sprained, he said. Badly. Needs binding. Later. Eliza. After the sheriff gets here, I want both hands free until then. He looked at Victor across the room. Victor was sitting in the chair with a rigidity that wasn't cooperation so much as the performance of it. The posture of a man enduring something temporary, who had not yet revised his assessment of the ultimate outcome. He really thought he could just walk in, Colton said. He's walked into rooms his whole life and gotten what he came for. You build a habit of that, it becomes your world model. Not this room. No, she said, not this one. Colton looked at her with something in his face she didn't categorize because categorizing it felt premature. Thomas appeared in the doorway with a cup and held it out to Eliza. Tea, very sweet, the way Clara made it, which was the way children made things when they were trying to do something for someone, and sweetness was the only dimension they could control. She took it with her good hand. Thank you, Thomas. He looked at Victor in the chair. Is that the bad man? he asked, with six-year-old directness. Thomas, Claire said from behind him. He is, though, Thomas said to Clara. Isn't he? Yes, Eliza said. He is, but he's not going to do anything now because, look, she gestured to the rope, to Doyle's knot work. He can't. Thomas studied Victor with the solemn attention he gave to things he was filing for permanent reference. Good, Thomas said, and went back to the kitchen. The sheriff arrived an hour later, not because Harlan was far, but because he'd apparently needed time to decide how he felt about the situation before he came to it. Sheriff Alderman was a man of late middle age who'd held his position for 11 years by being more careful than bold. And he came into the house with the careful neutrality of a man walking onto ice he wasn't sure about. He looked at Victor, at Collier, who was sitting at the kitchen table now with a cloth pressed to his shoulder and the controlled expression of a man waiting for a doctor, at the broken kitchen window, at Eliza's wrist. Mrs., he started. Miss Hartwell, she said. Miss Hartwell. He adjusted. You want to tell me what happened here? She told him, clearly, without embellishment, in the sequence it had occurred. Victor broke the door. Collier came through the window. She fired in defense of the house and the children. Victor grabbed her and she resisted. Colton arrived. She'd wanted to have this version clear in her mind before he came. And she did. Alderman listened without interrupting. He looked at Victor. You want to tell me something different? He said. Victor was very composed. She is my wife, he said. I came to bring her home. I had a legal right. You had no legal right to break into a man's house, Alderman said. I had a legal right to find my wife, who abandoned our marriage. Papers were filed in New Orleans, Eliza said. I have copies. Ben Aldis has copies. I'm aware of your papers, Victor said, with a dismissiveness that was itself a kind of violence. The way he could reduce 8 months of her careful, fearful legal maneuvering to a breath of contempt. They're contested. Until a court rules the marriage. Is that how this works? Colton said. He hadn't moved from the doorway. He asked the question not of Victor, but of Alderman. Alderman looked uncomfortable. The legal situation regarding contested divorce filings is she under arrest? Colton said. No. Is she required to go anywhere with him? Alderman paused. No. Then we can sort the marriage question out in court, Colton said, and in the meantime you can arrest him for breaking and entering an assault. Victor looked at him. The smile that wasn't a smile. On the testimony of a woman with a contested marital status and a ranch hand. And mine, said Pearl Okafor from the front doorway. Everyone turned. Pearl was standing on the porch in her coat, which meant she'd come directly from town the moment Doyle reached her, not waiting for the sheriff. Beside her was her husband James, who had the calm, solid presence of a man who'd survived enough to stop being impressed by performances of authority. I was at the fence line, Pearl said. She was looking at Alderman, not at Victor, and her look was the one she'd turned on Eliza that first day in the store, direct and measuring and completely uninterested in being managed. I came out to speak with Miss Hartwell about the waterboard finding. I watched this man. She looked at Victor without expression. Arrive at this property, break the front door and enter. I also heard what happened after. She came inside. Set her bag on the chair Colton pulled out for her. If you want my written statement, Sheriff, I'll give it to you now, she said. James will witness it. Victor's composure had developed a fault line, small, but Eliza could see it. He'd walked into rooms his whole life and gotten what he came for. He hadn't planned for Pearl Okafor. Victor and Collier were taken to the Harlan jail that night. Collier on the assault charge, which was clean and uncomplicated. Victor on the breaking and entering, which Alderman was less comfortable with but which Pearl's statement made impossible to avoid, and which Aldis arrived in time to reinforce with language that made avoidance even harder. The doctor, a thin woman named Dr. Faye Marsh, who'd been in Harlan for 3 years and had the brusque efficiency of someone who'd seen too much nonsense, bound Eliza's wrist, told her to keep it elevated for a week, and looked at the bruising on her arm with an expression that was professional and carefully neutral and which held underneath it something much less neutral. This wasn't new, she said. The arm, the old bruising, faded to yellow, but readable to a medical eye. No, Eliza said. Dr. Marsh wrote something in her casebook. I'm going to document this, she said. All of it, the wrist, the arm, the circumstances. Do I have your permission? Yes? This documentation could be used in the divorce proceedings. I know. The doctor looked at her for a moment, or really looked, in the way that people who dealt in bodies understood looking, which was less about the surface and more about the thing underneath it. You did well, she said. It wasn't soft and it wasn't congratulatory. It was the kind of statement a doctor made when she meant it as fact. Eliza didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded. Clara had put Thomas to bed by the time the doctor left, and the main room was quiet, and Doyle was asleep in the barn. His choice, he'd said, since the kitchen window needed boarding before the room was fit for use. Pearl and James had gone home. Aldous had gone back to town to file preliminary paperwork. Colton was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and the expression of a man at the end of a very long day. Eliza sat down across from him, the lamp between them, the same position. Your window is going to need a frame as well as the glass, she said. He looked at her. That's what you're thinking about. I'm also thinking about the fact that Victor will have lawyers in Brewster County within a week, she said. He has money and he has patience, and losing this round won't change either of those things. He'll argue the divorce from jail if he has to. Colton turned his cup in his hands. Aldous says the documentation Dr. Marsh is filing, combined with Pearl's statement and the breaking and entering charge, creates a clear picture that would be very difficult for any judge to ignore. Difficult isn't impossible. No. He set the cup down. But the New Orleans filing is solid, and Aldous has been in contact with the judge handling it. Victor's contest is on procedural grounds, not substantive ones. Aldous thinks... He paused, like he was weighing how much to say. Aldous thinks the judgment will come through within the month. Eliza sat with that for a moment. Within the month. The thing she'd spent 8 months maneuvering toward, carefully, terrifiedly, spending money she didn't have on a lawyer she'd found through a woman she'd barely known. Within the month. And Crow, she said, because she hadn't forgotten about Crow, even in the chaos of the past 2 days. In some ways, especially not. Something happened while I was moving the cattle, Colton said. Doyle told me on the ride back. He turned the cup again. The county surveyor was out at the headwater 3 days ago, the one Aldous requested after I filed the documentation of the creek contamination. He found the diversion equipment Crow had installed. Pipes buried on the creek bank. Documented, photographed, and reported to the state land office in Austin. Eliza looked at him. Crow had the county inspector managed, Colton continued, but he didn't manage the state. Aldous went directly to Austin because... He looked at her, because someone told him not to let one man control all the routes. She felt something move in her chest, small and warm and complicated. The state filing carries, Colton said. Crow's diversion equipment is an illegal modification of documented water access. He'll have to remove it, and the attempt to interfere with the water rights will be part of the record when the corrective amendment on the title filing comes through. He'll fight it. He'll try, but he's been fighting from the position of a man who thought no one was watching and now everyone is. Colton paused. Turns out a few of the other ranchers south of the ridge had been noticing the water level too. They just hadn't known what to do about it. When Aldous started making noise, 2 of them came forward. Eliza thought about the creek at low water, the brownish jar on her windowsill, the way the cattle had walked to the south trough, when the instinct in them knew something was wrong. Sometimes it started with noticing. Sometimes noticing was the whole battle. He'll still have resources, she said. Crow, he won't just disappear. No, Colton said, but a man whose methods have been documented and whose illegal activity is in the state record doesn't operate the same way he did when he thought he was invisible. He looked at her steadily. And he doesn't have the easy target anymore. The water claim is corrected. The contamination is on record. The title is clean. He's lost the angle. She let herself believe this. Carefully. The way you believed in structures you'd built yourself. Not completely, not blindly, but with the knowledge that you'd done the work and the work was sound. The ranch is going to be all right, she said. The ranch was always going to be all right, he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite what the words said. The question was just whether it would be all right this way or some other way. She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the wind was doing the thing it did at night out here, moving through the grass in long, slow draws that sounded almost like water. Fleet was on the porch. She could hear him shift and settle. The house was quiet, with the specific quiet of a place that had just been through something and was now provisionally, not. I want to ask you something, Colton said. All right. When I walked into that kitchen, he stopped, started again. You had the shotgun up and you were... Another stop, like he was looking for the right word and not finding it immediately. You were not what I expected to find. I don't know exactly what I expected. Someone who needed me to come back, I suppose. Someone who'd been... He gestured without completing it. Saved, she said, without bitterness. Just saying the word. Yes. He met her eyes. But that's not what was happening. No. You'd already stopped him. I'd stopped him from getting to me, she said, careful about the precision of it. That's different from resolved. If you hadn't come when you did, I'd have been holding that position for a long time with a bad wrist and one fired rifle and a man bleeding on my floor. She paused. So I'm not going to tell you I didn't need you. I did. But not to be saved. I needed you to finish it, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a moment. The way he was quiet when something was going somewhere he hadn't expected, and he was adjusting. Yes, he said. There is. She waited to see if there was more, and there was. I went back because the dog came, he said, but I'd thought about going back before that, twice. I told you that. He looked at his hands. I want to be honest with you. I don't have a history of... He chose the words like he was choosing them from a specific pile of paying attention to what was behind me. Margaret used to say I could look right past a person without meaning to. I know. He looked up. You know. I've watched you for 6 weeks, she said. You see things on the land very clearly. You see what's wrong with a fence line or a water level or a herd before most people would. People you're sometimes slower with. He didn't argue it. Yes. You're getting faster. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in the same family. I want to make a change to the ranch deed, he said. I spoke to Aldous about it on the way back in. He thinks it's straightforward. Eliza looked at him. The property is filed under my name and Margaret's estate. When the estate was settled, it should have been re-registered, but it wasn't, and it's been sitting in a gray area for 2 years. He looked at his cup. Aldous is going to clean that up. And when he does, I want to add your name. She was very still. Not because you're a... He stopped. Not as a formal title arrangement, as a property holder, equal ownership. He looked at her now. You've earned it, in 6 weeks. The water line, the title amendment, the creek documentation, the garden, the window, the bolt, the children in the root cellar. He paused. The front you held when I wasn't here. Colton. I know it's fast, he said. I know we've barely learned each other. I know you came here as an arrangement, and arrangements aren't the same thing as... He stopped again. Other things. He was not a fluent man, she'd established that, but what he was honest, and the honesty came through the edges of the places where the fluency ran out. But I don't want you to feel like you're here because of an arrangement. I want you to know that the land is yours because you fought for it. Whatever else happens between us, that part should be yours. She sat for a long moment looking at this man who told her to leave on the first day and had come back from the cattle drive because a dog had showed up without her, and he'd been thinking about turning back before that anyway. You'll be putting your name on a deed with a woman who still has a contested divorce in New Orleans, she said. That's complicated. Aldous says it'll be settled within the month. Within the month is not yet. Within the month isn't long. He looked at her steadily. I've waited longer for worse reasons. She looked at her bound wrist on the table, at the lamp, at his hands around the cold cup. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes to the deed, yes. Something happened in his face. Not dramatic, he was not a dramatic man. Something quieter than drama and more lasting. All right, he said. In the weeks that followed, the news moved through Harlan the way news moved through small places, not in an announcement, but as accumulation. People heard about the break-in. They heard about Pearl's statement and Dr. Marsh's documentation. They heard about the state land office and the diversion pipes on Crow's Creek bank. They heard about the corrective amendment and the 2 other ranchers who'd come forward with their own water level records. Marcus Crow did not disappear. Men like Crow didn't disappear. But he grew quieter, which was its own kind of change. His lawyer appeared at Aldous' office twice in the following month with proposals. Not for the water easement now, just for a negotiated resolution to the contamination finding. And Aldous handled them with the meticulous care of a man who understood that paper was a form of memory, and memory was a form of power. Victor's lawyers arrived, as Eliza had predicted. Two of them, from San Antonio, carrying an argument about the New Orleans filing that was better constructed than she'd feared. Aldous countered with Dr. Marsh's documentation and Pearl's statement and two sworn depositions from women in Georgia who'd been afraid to speak before, and were now, for reasons she'd never fully know, a little less afraid. The judge in New Orleans took 4 weeks and then ruled. The day the ruling came through, Aldous rode out to the ranch himself rather than sending a letter. He handed her the document in the kitchen, with Clara watching from the doorway, and Thomas visible through the window in the yard, and Eliza read it standing up, the same way Colton read things. She read it once, then again. Then she set it on the table. "It's done?" Clara asked. "It's done," Eliza said. Clara came into the kitchen and stood next to her and looked at the document with the serious attention she gave to things she was filing permanently. "What happens now?" Clara asked. Eliza looked at the document, at Clara, at Thomas through the window, who had found something fascinating in the dirt near the paddock fence and was crouched examining it with the focused devotion of a 6-year-old scientist. "Now we plant the second row of the squash," she said. "We missed the window by 2 weeks and we might not get a harvest before the cold, but it's worth trying." Clara considered this. "And everything else?" "Everything else," Eliza said, "we figure out as we go." Clara's expression was not entirely satisfied with this answer, but was not entirely unsatisfied either. She was, Eliza had learned, a child who preferred plans, who liked to know the shape of things before they happened. That was not a habit she'd been born with. That was a habit children grew when the shape of things had changed too many times without warning. Eliza understood it from the inside. "The squash will probably be fine," Clara said eventually, with the careful optimism of someone who'd learned not to say things they couldn't back up. "It will," Eliza said. "The soil's right, and it's been a warm fall." The deed amendment came through the following week. Aldous brought it on a Thursday, and Eliza and Colton both signed it at the kitchen table, and Doyle witnessed it with the expression of a man who'd seen a lot of things on this ranch in the past 6 weeks, and had revised most of his expectations accordingly. When it was done, when Aldous had gone, and Doyle had gone back to the paddock, and the children were occupied elsewhere, Colton put the deed in the strongbox in his office, and came back to the kitchen doorway, and stood there looking at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. That direct, unperforming look she'd come to know as him at his most real, without the assessed quality or the guarded quality, or any of the layers that a person accumulated over years of being alone with too much on their shoulders. "You should know something," he said. "That first day, when I told you to leave." "I remember. I didn't mean it the way it came out." She waited. "I meant—" He worked through it. "I meant that I couldn't afford to need someone who wasn't going to stay. The last time I needed someone, she didn't get a choice about leaving, and I thought—" Another stop, and then he said it plainly, which was how he said all his honest things, without decoration. "I thought you looked like someone who'd been through something and would probably leave when it got hard." "I've been through something," she said, "but I don't leave when things get hard. That's not what I learned to do." "I know that now." "What did you think I'd learn to do?" He considered it. "Endure and go quiet." She thought about Victor's kitchen, the locked door, the soup bowl. "That too," she said. "For a while, but quiet stops working eventually. You either learn to push back or you disappear." She looked at him. "I didn't want to disappear." He held her eyes for a moment that was longer than a functional pause. "I'm glad you didn't," he said. Outside, Fleet barked once at something in the pasture. A rabbit, probably, or just the impulse, and then went quiet. The sound of Thomas talking to himself drifted from the direction of the paddock, a continuous small narrative that required no audience. The late afternoon light was doing the thing it did in fall, going gold and long-shadowed and making the flatland look less flat, the distances compressing into something more manageable. Eliza turned back to the squash seedlings she'd been tending on the kitchen windowsill. They were leggy but alive, reaching for the light. She had work to do. The squash came in late, as Eliza had warned Clara it might, but it came in. Not abundantly. 3 of the 6 plants produced, and the yield was modest, the fruit smaller than it would have been with a full season behind it. But Clara carried them in from the garden on a Saturday morning in November with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd been told something was uncertain and had watched it become certain through daily attention. And she set them on the kitchen counter and looked at them with a pride she was trying not to show too openly, which was the best kind of pride. "I told you the soil was right," Eliza said. "You said it might be fine," Clara said. "That's different from telling me." "It is. You're right." Clara looked at her sideways, checking for condescension, found none, and allowed herself a small, direct smile that she didn't deploy often enough. Thomas came in from outside with dirt up to his elbows and an expression of complete innocence that was its own form of confession. He looked at the squash. "Can we eat it tonight?" "We can eat some of it tonight," Clara said, in the older sister voice she used when she was performing competence. "All of it." "Thomas." "I'm just asking." Eliza turned back to the stove before either of them saw her expression. Some mornings the kitchen felt ordinary and she forgot, briefly, everything that had built toward it. Then she'd hear them bicker about squash and feel the full accumulated weight of what ordinary meant now, how much it had cost to get here, how different it was from what ordinary used to feel like. That was not a bad feeling. It was just an honest one. Winter came to Brewster County, the way winter came to that part of Texas. Not dramatically, not with the heavy, decisive cold of more northern places, but in a gradual tightening, the mornings going sharp and the afternoons staying cool even when the sun was full. The grass dried to a pale gold. The creek ran clear again, properly clear, the way it ran before anyone had touched it. The diversion equipment came off Crow's Headwater property in late October, removed by order of the State Land Office, and witnessed by James Okafor, whose written account of the removal became part of the permanent county record. Crow himself was not present for the removal. He sent a lawyer. The lawyer had delivered, on Crow's behalf, a formal withdrawal of the easement proposal. No further offers. No further communications regarding the Southern Water access. Aldous had read it twice, the way he read things he wanted to be certain about, and then called it a strategic retreat rather than a resolution, because Aldous was careful with language and careful with hope. And that carefulness was exactly what made him valuable. "He hasn't given up," Aldous said. "He's reassessing." "Let him reassess," Colton said. "Just don't become complacent about it." Eliza, who had been present for this conversation in Aldous' small office, said, "We won't." She meant it collectively, which was something she'd started doing without noticing, using we where she once would have said I, not as a performance of domesticity, but as an accurate description of how the work actually happened. The decisions were made together. The records were kept by both of them. The water board correspondence, the state filings, the ongoing documentation of creek levels. She maintained those with the same attention she'd given to the garden map, to the stove damper, to the reseated bolt on the back door. Colton had stopped being surprised by what she knew. That itself felt like a form of respect. Victor's case moved through the Brewster County Court in November. Breaking and entering was straightforward. The assault documentation, Dr. Marsh's written account, and Pearl's testimony made the assault charge equally clean. Victor's San Antonio lawyers argued extenuating circumstances in the marriage. The word abandoned was used several times. And the judge, a woman named Henrietta Bragg, who had been on the bench for 9 years and had heard most available varieties of nonsense, had looked at the documentation and then at the lawyers and said that the circumstances of a marriage did not extend a man's legal authority to break into another man's property and physically restrain a woman who had filed legal separation papers. Victor received 60 days for the break-in and a fine for the assault that was large enough to be inconvenient, but not large enough to injure him seriously, because that was how courts worked with men who had money, and Eliza had known that going in. She hadn't expected justice to be proportional. She'd only needed it to be documented. What mattered was the New Orleans ruling. What mattered was the record in Brewster County that would follow Victor Hale's name through any future legal proceeding he attempted. What mattered was Collier, who had taken the deal Aldous helped arrange and provided a written account of Victor's instructions in exchange for a reduced charge, an account that named dates, named amounts, described the tracking methodology, and the 2 prior women and what had happened to each of them. That document lived in Aldous' files and in the state record, and in a copy that Eliza kept in the strongbox beside the ranch deed. She understood by then that safety wasn't a destination. You didn't arrive at it and unpack. You built it the same way you built anything worth having, piece by piece, documented, witnessed, held in place by the work you continued to put into it. That was not a lesson she'd wanted to learn the way she'd learned it, but she'd learned it thoroughly. Pearl Okafor came to the ranch for the first time in December, not on business, just to come. She brought a jar of her own preserves and a piece of information she'd been sitting on for 2 weeks. Crow's in a dispute with his eastern neighbor, she said. She was at the kitchen table with coffee, and she delivered information the way she ran her store, without preamble, without performance. Water rights again? Different creek? Different county? He's going to be occupied. How long? Colton asked. Long enough that he's had to hire 2 more lawyers. Pearl looked at her coffee. A man in that many legal disputes at once doesn't have the attention span for new ones. Eliza set preserves on the table and thought about Crow, the patient smile, the practiced patience. Even occupied men circled back eventually, but Pearl was right that occupied was better than not. Thank you, Eliza said. Pearl looked at her with the same direct assessment she'd used that first day in the store, the one that took inventory without being rude about it. You've changed this place, she said. I want you to know I see that. Eliza wasn't sure what to say to this. Gratitude felt too small, and deflection felt wrong. The place needed changing, she said. Lots of places need it, Pearl said. Most of them don't get it. They just need it until they fall down. She picked up her coffee. You stayed. I stayed. That's the whole thing, isn't it? That's the whole story. Pearl looked at her over the cup. Everyone leaves when it gets bad. The ones who stay and do something with the staying, that's a different kind of person. Eliza looked at the table, thought about $31 in a boot on a train platform, thought about the 14 months before that, thought about the moment she'd stood at the kitchen window watching a stranger approach and known, with the certainty of someone who'd spent years learning what danger looked like, exactly what she was dealing with, and what she intended to do about it. She hadn't stayed because it was easy. She hadn't stayed because she was brave in the romantic sense of the word, the sense that implied fearlessness or confidence or some innate character quality that other people lacked. She'd been afraid from the first day to the last bad night and several times in between. She'd been uncertain. She'd been exhausted. She'd made decisions that might have gone wrong and some that still might. She'd stayed because leaving had stopped being the thing that made sense. That was the whole of it. You ran until you found somewhere that made staying make more sense, and then you stayed, and you worked, and you held on. I think most people could do it, Eliza said, if they found the right place. Pearl looked at her for a moment and didn't agree or disagree, which was its own kind of agreement. The first real argument she and Colton had happened in January. It was about cattle, specifically about selling 12 head from the South herd to cover a repair cost on the barn roof that Colton thought could wait and Eliza thought could not. She had numbers. He had stubbornness. Both were presented with enough force that Clara, who was doing schoolwork at the kitchen table, quietly gathered her books and went to her room without being asked. The roof will hold through spring, Colton said. It held through last spring because last spring was dry, Eliza said. This winter's wetter. You've already had 2 leaks in the northwest corner. I've had 2 drips. Drips become leaks, leaks become rot. Rot becomes a barn you can't afford to replace. She set the ledger on the table between them. The numbers are there. 12 head at current market covers the repair with something left over. Those 12 are from the breeding group. 10 of them are. 2 aren't. Sell those 2 plus the 4 I've marked from the north group that aren't producing. He looked at her. That's 6. 6 won't cover it. 6 covers the immediate repair. The remaining cost we carry to spring market and clear it then. He didn't answer immediately. You've been doing the book since September, he said. Not accusatory. Yes. Why didn't I know there was a carrying cost? You did know, she said. Aldous sent the quarterly summary in November. He'd read it. She'd been there when he read it, but he'd read it the way people read things when they were dealing with 17 other things at the same time. The barn, she said. That's the decision in front of us. He looked at the ledger, then at her. 6 head and carry to spring, he said. Yes. If spring market's down, we adjust, she said, but a collapsed barn section in March costs more than a soft spring market. He was quiet for a moment. not resistant, thinking. "All right," he said. She closed the ledger. He said, "I read things too fast." "I know. You're going to keep telling me when I miss things. That's the arrangement." He looked at her with something that was the closest thing she'd seen on his face to humor that wasn't reluctant. "You've got a specific idea of what this arrangement is." "Someone has to." "Margaret would have liked you," he said, and he said it without weight, which was the only way it could have been said without meaning the wrong thing, as a plain statement, as information. "I hope so," Eliza said. "I've liked her garden." He nodded once. Then he went to get his coat because there were still 6 hours of daylight and a ranch that required them. Well, she thought about Margaret more than seemed reasonable for a woman she'd never known. She lived in Margaret's house, tended Margaret's garden, slept in the room where Margaret had watched the back pasture from the bed, on mornings when the window framed it just right. The embroidery hoop had been moved, eventually, not put away, but hung on the wall in the back bedroom, where it remained a piece of unfinished work that nobody needed to finish. Some things were complete without their endings. She thought about her own mother, who had died when Eliza was 17, and who she resembled in ways she couldn't fully measure. She thought about the years between her mother's death and Victor, the teaching, the small freedoms, the life she'd been building that had seemed, at the time, like enough. She thought about what she'd believed love looked like before she met a man who'd used the word to mean something that had nothing to do with what she'd needed. She didn't hate Victor anymore. That surprised her, the first time she noticed it. She'd expected hate to be something you held on to because it was useful, because it had kept her moving when fear wanted her to stop. But hate was expensive in the long run. It occupied room that other things needed. What she had instead was a clear-eyed understanding of what he was and what she'd required of herself to survive it, and a very specific intention never to require that of herself again. She wrote to Nora in January. A real letter, long, with actual content. The squash, the water case, the deed, the judge's ruling, the way the ranch looked in winter with frost on the fence posts and the cattle steam-breathing in the cold morning air. She wrote about Clara's garden map and Thomas's wooden horse and Pearl's assessment and the argument about the barn roof and the way Colton read things too fast. She wrote, "I don't know what this is, entirely. I know what it isn't, and that turns out to be more than enough to start with." Nora wrote back within 3 weeks, which was fast for San Antonio to Brewster County, which meant she'd answered the same day she received it. She wrote, "You sound like yourself. I hadn't heard you sound like yourself in years." Eliza read this at the kitchen table on a gray afternoon in February and sat with it for a while. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure she'd cried properly since Georgia, the mechanism having gotten stuck somewhere in the years of not being able to afford it. But something in her chest recognized the sentence with a recognition that was close enough to the same thing. Spring came early to that part of Texas, and with it came the matter Aldous had predicted, Victor's formal appeal of the Brewster County judgment. His lawyers were very good and the appeal had technical merit, which was not the same as moral merit, but in courts the distinction was sometimes less clear than it should have been. Eliza sat in Aldous' office with Colton and listened to the legal architecture of the argument, which was built on the contested status of the New Orleans filing at the time of the incident. The argument that the marriage had not yet been legally dissolved when the break-in occurred, and therefore Victor had an arguable claim to the right of access. "It won't succeed," Aldous said. He was not a man who made confident predictions, which made this one carry weight. "Why not?" Colton asked. "Because the New Orleans ruling is retroactive to the filing date," Aldous said, "which predates the incident by 8 months. Victor's lawyers know this. They're filing the appeal to delay and to cost." He looked at Eliza. "They believe you'll eventually accept a settlement to make it stop." Eliza looked at her hands. The wrist had healed cleanly, faster than Dr. Marsh had estimated, leaving nothing but the memory of the specific ache, which faded further each month until it was less a physical thing and more a footnote. "What does a settlement look like?" she asked. Not because she was considering it, because she needed to know the shape of the thing she was declining. Aldous outlined it. Victor would drop the appeal in exchange for a release of liability. She would agree not to pursue additional civil action based on the documented history of harm. His name would be cleared of the Collier-provided testimony's implications in any future proceedings. She listened to all of it. "No," she said. Aldous nodded, as if this was what he'd expected. The appeal will run its course, he said, probably 4 months. It will fail. But I want you to be prepared for a period of I know what continued uncertainty feels like, Eliza said. I've been living in it for 2 years. 4 more months isn't pleasant, but it's manageable. Colton was looking at his hat, which he was holding in both hands, turning it the way he turned his cup when he was thinking. Is there anything we can do to accelerate it? Not much. The court moves at its own pace. Aldous paused. There is one thing. The Collier testimony. If Collier were willing to formalize it as a sworn deposition for the appellate record, it would significantly complicate Victor's narrative. Would he? He's already served his reduced sentence. He has no legal obligation, but he also has no particular reason to protect Victor at this point. Aldous turned a pen in his hands. I could reach out through the appropriate channels. Do it, Eliza said. Collier provided the deposition in March. It took 6 weeks to process through the appellate system, and in May, the appeal was denied. The judgment stood. The county record stood. The Collier deposition became part of a permanent file that lived in the State Archive in Austin, and that Victor Hale's name was now attached to in ways that could not be removed by settlement or legal maneuvering or money. Aldous sent word on a Tuesday. She was in the garden when Colton came out with the letter. He handed it to her and watched her read it. She read it once, set it down on her knee, looked at the garden, at the full green rows of it, the tomatoes staked properly and producing, the squash mounds larger than last fall, a section of beans Clara had added of her own initiative, neat and functional. It's done, Colton said. It's done, she said. He crouched beside her in the dirt, which was not something he did often. He was not a man who crouched, who sat on floors, who occupied spaces below his full height. He did it now without appearing to think about it. What does it feel like? He asked. She looked at the tomatoes, at the beans, at the fence line in the distance, the posts reset and plumb, holding what they were supposed to hold. Like I can plan more than a month ahead, she said. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. I've been thinking, he said. About what? He looked at her sideways. Whether you'd want to make the arrangement more formal. She looked at him. The deed is already amended, he said. You own half the land. I'm not asking about that. He was looking at the fence line, not at her, which was how he looked at things when he was being most honest about them. I'm asking about the other thing. She sat with that for a moment. The garden around them, the sound of Thomas somewhere near the barn. He'd recently become interested in helping Doyle with the morning feeding, which Doyle bore with the stoicism of a man who understood that 6-year-olds had to start somewhere. The late morning sky doing nothing dramatic, just being wide and blue and completely uninterested in the smallness of human decisions made beneath it. She thought about what Pearl had said. Everyone leaves when it gets bad. The ones who stay and do something with the staying, that's a different kind of person. She thought about Nora's letter. You sound like yourself. She thought about the woman who'd arrived at this ranch with $31 in her boot and a wrist that hadn't finished hurting, and the specific bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd been surviving for so long they'd forgotten what living felt like. And she thought about who she was now. Not because the ranch had saved her, not because Colton had saved her, not because anything external had reached in and repaired what had been broken. She'd done that work herself, the way you always had to do that work, in the daily accumulation of small decisions, in the fixing of things that were broken, in the staying when staying was hard, in the refusing to be made small by people who needed you small in order to feel large. She was not a woman who'd been rescued. She was a woman who'd found a place where what she already was could be used properly. That was the thing she understood now that she hadn't understood in Georgia, or on the train platform, or in the first frightening weeks of this strange arrangement in a place that hadn't wanted her. You didn't find yourself by running. You found yourself by stopping somewhere real and doing real work and seeing what you were made of when the easy exit was no longer the automatic choice. She had stopped here. She had done the work. She knew what she was made of. Yes, she said. Colton looked at her. Yes. Yes, she said again. He nodded once, slowly. All right. You're not going to say anything else? I thought I'd save it. For when? For when there's less dirt involved. He looked at the garden around them, the two of them crouched in the soil. This wasn't how I planned to ask. I didn't know you planned anything. I plan things, he said with mild offense. I planned the south herd rotation in February, and it worked out. That's cattle. The principle is the same. She looked at him for a moment. This man who saw the land more clearly than he saw people and was learning, slowly, to see both. Who read things too fast and turned his cup in his hands when he was working something out and had stood in a broken doorway with a rifle and a look on his face that she would not forget for the rest of her life. Who had said, I thought you looked like someone who'd been through something and would probably leave when it got hard. Who had come back from the cattle drive because the dog had come without her and he'd been thinking about turning back before that anyway. The dirt is fine, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee, briefly, and stood back up, because there was still a full afternoon of work, and they both knew it, and that was also part of what this was. The knowledge that the ordinary continued, that life didn't pause for its own significant moments, that the tomatoes needed staking whether or not you'd just decided something large. She stood up too. Clara appeared at the garden gate with the expression she wore when she'd been close enough to hear something but was pretending she hadn't been. Lunch is ready, she said. We're coming, Eliza said. Clara looked at them both with the dark, serious eyes that saw more than a 9-year-old should have to see, and then she allowed herself a very small, very deliberate smile and went back to the house. Thomas's voice came from the direction of the barn. Fleet ate something he shouldn't. That dog, Doyle said from somewhere nearby, in the voice of a man who had been saying that sentence for 3 years. Colton moved toward the barn. Eliza moved toward the house. The morning continued in its ordinary direction, which was not a small thing to say about a place and a life. There is a particular lie that people tell about survival, that it ends, that once the danger has passed, once the papers are filed and the judgments are entered and the men who wanted to take things away from you have run out of legal options and retreated to their other battles, you are finished surviving and something else begins. Something cleaner. Something that doesn't require that constant low-frequency alertness that becomes, after years, so habitual, you forget it's there until a day arrives when it's quieter. The truth is more complicated and more human than that. The truth is that survival doesn't end. It changes. The same attentiveness that had kept Eliza alive in Victor's house, the reading of rooms, the assessment of exits, the knowledge of where danger lived and how it moved, was the same attentiveness that had seen the water problem before anyone else did, that had noticed the paddock posts and the stove damper and the county record ambiguity and the way Pearl Okafor's pricing had drifted upward into territory that no one was challenging. The skills she'd built to endure a small and violent life turned out to be, in a larger and more open one, the skills of someone who could hold things together when they were trying to fall apart. She didn't know if that was justice exactly. It wasn't the kind of story where the suffering turned out to have been secretly good, secretly instructive, secretly worth it. It wasn't worth it. Nothing that happened in that kitchen in Georgia was worth it. But she'd come through it with things she hadn't gone in with, and in the end you used what you had. What she had, on a morning in late spring on a ranch in Brewster County, Texas, in the year 1880, with the creek running clear and the garden producing and the legal record finally clean, and the man in the next room reading the quarterly summary faster than he should, and the girl in the garden, and the boy narrating his own experience to a dog who tolerated it with profound patience. What she had was enough, more than enough. It was a life, an actual one, full of problems that needed solving and work that needed doing, and people who drove her to occasional distraction and who she would not have traded for anything quieter. She stood at the kitchen window on that spring morning, the same window Collier had come through, now properly reframed and glassed, with a new latch she'd installed herself, which worked better than the original, and looked at the back pasture, the whole long reach of it running green to the fence line and beyond. Home was not a place where you hid from the world. She'd tried that, and it didn't hold. Home was the place where you were known. Not perfectly, not without friction, not without the daily work of two people learning to occupy the same space honestly, but known. Where your history didn't disqualify you, where what you could do mattered more than what had been done to you, where you could stand at a window on an ordinary morning and not be afraid of what was coming. She turned back to the stove, where something needed tending, and tended it.